Okay, hello again, everybody. Welcome to our closing keynote of the Good Systems Symposium. I know some of you are still grabbing some food and you know, you're enjoying your lunch. I guess we'll try to keep the clinking to a minimum so we can hear our speaker, but he'll be mic'd up nicely. We're very fortunate to have Sanmay Das, who's a professor of computer science and associate director of AI for social impact at the Sangani Center for AI and Data Analysis at Virginia Tech's Innovation Campus, which is a new Virginia Tech campus in the Washington, D.C. area. So it's not in Blacksburg, but still associated with the same university. He has research interests across AI, and I've known him professionally for more than 20 years. His first visit to campus was to my lab when he was a new faculty member. We think back in 2008 or so, and we've known each other from conferences from before then. He has research interests across AI, machine learning, computational social science, and his recent work focuses on the use of AI in the allocation of scarce societal resources with an eye towards the distributive justice implications of different policies and mechanisms. He has lots of leadership roles. He's won many awards. I'm not going to list those off. You can find them on his webpage. But to give Sanmay as much time as possible, I'll let you take it away, and let's welcome him.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to Good Systems for the invitation to be here. I've really enjoyed the past couple of days and getting to learn about everything that's going on. It's really an impressive set of things that's going on over here, and just the kind of initiative that I wish were going on at every university across the U.S. as much as possible. So I'm really, really impressed with everything that all of you have been able to accomplish over here. And thanks to Peter for that very generous introduction. I'll just make the brief point that Peter is one of the people who I really admire in the field, and I think everyone does. And one of the reasons for that is just he is so good to junior people. He's always willing to help out and spend time helping people, and that's what I remember from coming here in 2008 and just getting incredible advice from somebody who I'd run into at conferences but really had no obligation to give me that kind of advice. So always very grateful for everything that he does for the community and for me as well. So yes, one gets old, I guess, all right, so let me talk a little bit about what I'm going to tell you about, and I feel like it might be interestingly complementary to many of the things that I've been hearing about over the last couple days. And so I want to talk about AI alignment in the provision of social services. So I'll get more specific about what I mean about that, but in general, right, the setting that I'm going to be thinking of is situations where we have resources that are being allocated by, some agency of the state, right? So this is not the free market. This is not necessarily private enterprise. It is something where we are thinking about, things that we expect the state to be providing in one form or the other. And in those kinds of situations, right, the questions are, I think, a little bit different than they end up being in various other domains. And so we've heard a lot about AI alignment as a term over the past few years, and I wanted to think the reason why this title says AI alignment is because I really wanted to think about what does it actually mean to align AI. And so what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time just going through something that is only peripherally related to any of the specific research that I'm going to talk about, but I think really sets the stage for that, which is a New York Times article that piqued my interest when I saw it. This was in October of last year, and it's titled, "Nevada Asked AI Which Students Need Help? The Answer Caused an Outcry." And so I'm annotating this article, and I want to come back to some of these issues as I'll be talking today. But if you look at this, it says, so I know it's going to be hard to read. I'll read out the key points that I've highlighted over here. The new system cut the number of students deemed at risk in the state by 200,000. That's kind of the lead, right? And then it says, the AI system calculated that the state's previous estimate of the number of children who would struggle in school was far too high. So this is interesting, right? So first of all, it's anthropomorphizing AI, which I think is not something that is reasonable to do. And so, the AI system is not deciding that, that's what's happening. And we don't actually have any evidence that it did this at this point in time. We'll see what we actually have evidence for in a second. And then there's the thing that says when the calculations were done, the number of students classified as at risk plummeted to less than 65,000 from over 270,000 in 2022. So AI coming in, having a big impact, right? And this is something that we see all the time, right? AI, for one thing, can operate at scale that humans do not necessarily or cannot necessarily operate at. And so it can have big impacts when it's deployed in these kinds of systems. And so it's important to think about what's going on in those situations. But I was curious to dig a little bit deeper into like what actually happened in this case, because this article leaves many questions unanswered. So I went and I looked up. So the New America Foundation had a little bit of a deeper dive into it. And so it says, okay, this new policy reflects a choice to allocate at-risk funding based not on economic need, but on a compound metric that is far less clearly defined. And then it says it's neither transparent nor better targeted. So that's at least making a point over here. What the evidence for that point is not yet even entirely clear, and we don't know. So then I went back and found something even a little bit older than that, which is Education Week, which, as you would hope, provides a little bit more information on what was going on, and I think will now lead to some of the questions that I'm hoping to structure the rest of this talk around. So first of all, the very first line, though, is continuing this slight rant against the way people talk about AI, right? So it says, the algorithm makes its predictions based on an assessment of 150 million student years worth of data on students' academic performance, attendance, behavior. Oh my goodness, 150 million student years worth of data? I mean, how could it possibly be wrong, right? I mean, this is, I think, what the exact kind of thing that Arvind Narayanan and Sayash Kapoor call AI snake oil. And they have this great book out now that's titled that, right? It's like, okay, what does this even mean, right? If you have 150 million student years worth of data, are you telling me directly that data from Greenwich, Connecticut is directly comparable to data across the state of Nevada? Like, if not, like, tell me something a little more detailed about it. So, okay, so that's one. Now, let's get to point number 2. It says it employs a machine learning algorithm to assess the likelihood that each student whose data enters the system will or will not graduate. Now, here's something that seems, at least to me, a completely sensible thing to do. Right, it is you're trying to identify students who are at risk. What are you trying to identify what they're at risk for? Let's spell that out, right? Let's think about what the construct over here is and what we can measure that tries to get at the underlying thing. It seems to be reasonable to say, will this student graduate or will this student not graduate as the kind of thing that you're trying to measure. So that compound metric is in itself not necessarily the wrong thing to be measuring, but I do want to highlight that what we choose to measure and whether we have construct validity is going to be a very important question as we go through. But now, here's the real kicker, which says Nevada uses them for a different purpose. Each October 1st, all students that the system slots into the high risk and medium risk categories qualify for additional state aid for their districts. 35 cents extra for every dollar they get through the state's base per pupil funding. So that's what's going on over here, and that's why people were very upset about it, because it was causing a massive redistribution of aid across districts, right? It wasn't actually cutting the budget at this point, although I have little doubt that people would try to use it to cut the budget down the line if they wanted to. But it's leading to redistribution. That's when people are getting upset about it, because some schools are losing money, some other schools are getting money through this, and that's going to lead to questions about, why did this happen? So, okay, so we're seeing this kind of redistribution. Now, here's the really interesting point. The infinite campus system considers students who fall below the 5th percentile of all the scores to be at high risk, and then those between the 5th and 20th percentile are considered medium risk. This is a default in their software, all right? It's saying, if you take this whole thing, 20% of students are going to be in these two risk categories. The state of Nevada decided, we'll just accept that. It's 20%. The AI doesn't matter. If you go back, if you remember the lead thing in the New York Times article, oh, it cut the students deemed at risk from 270,000 down to 65,000. Why did it do this? Because the default in the software says you pick the top 20%. It doesn't matter what the AI was saying or how it ranked the students. If you made this decision, that's what would end up happening, right? So this is really sort of an example of AI getting blamed for, the headline on this at any rate, for something that really has nothing to do with AI. It's about a misunderstanding between the people who are responsible for implementing and taking the outputs of that AI and actually putting that into practice to achieve the goals that you're trying to achieve. And so what I want to talk about, right, and what can we learn from this is I think intrinsically we cannot untangle AI systems and their human users, right? Because they're going to get used in exactly these kinds of manners in all of these situations. And therefore, this notion of AI alignment is intrinsically a human, a strategic, and a multi-agent endeavor that we need to be thinking about in these situations. So from the human side, we have to think about what it is that we're trying to achieve. And that is essentially, I would argue, a social and political question rather than a technical question, right? We need to think about what is our goal over here as decision makers? What have we decided as a society our priority is in the specific domain that we're looking at? For example, in what we were just looking at, we could be thinking about, OK, what do I want to do? Do I want to maximize my graduation rate? Do I want some form of equity goals? I want to make sure that students in very poor districts are still performing OK. It's we need to figure out what the overall goal of the system is before we say, OK, we're going to use AI to try and achieve this and think about doing that. But actually, I think that for that, thinking through an AI lens or a formal lens in general can really help to clarify this question. It makes you try to sit down and specify your objectives in a way that can actually be quite meaningful. There's also various other points in the pipeline where I think AI can be really helpful, and we should think about what it can do. And so I will try to give a few examples of these as I go on. One of these is the measurement problem, which is to say, OK, can AI and machine learning perhaps do a better job of measuring things that we might care about? And an example of this is just, can AI do better at predicting the probability that somebody will fail to graduate given what we know about that student? Now, that's an empirical question, right? We have to try to figure out, OK, is it better at sort of predicting risks than alternative techniques might be? But one point that I'll continue coming back to is it's not like we're not trying to do this as is, right? And it's not that we have some human decision makers who are just automatically really good at this. What we should be comparing the AI against is what is the status quo, how is that done, and can we do better than that in terms of trying to achieve the objectives that we're trying to achieve? So the other point of this that comes up a lot and is an interesting challenge for machine learning is I really think about predicting the outcomes of different interventions. And that's a similar problem, right? And you think, OK, I can throw a machine learning technique at this to say, OK, what happens if I give this student this kind of intervention? How likely are they to graduate in that case? The issue here becomes that this is a causally very challenging problem, because the data that you have is based on past policy regimes, right? The people who have gotten these interventions in the past will be of particular types, and therefore we may not have the distributional variety that we would need for AI to be, or for machine learning methods in general to be able to make good predictions without thinking carefully about the challenges posed to causality and counterfactual prediction in those kinds of situations. AI can also be used in various other ways over here. And two that I'll highlight are, one is just actually in performing the optimization once we've spelled out the goals and the measurement. And then the last one is actually reasoning about the preferences and incentives of those who participate in the system. Because when you put in a new system, when you put a new system into place, people are going to respond to the system that you put into place. You're changing their incentives. And when you do that, you need to think about what kinds of outcomes this is likely to lead to and whether you can do things to make sure that, whether they're unintended outcomes or not, to mitigate any possible sort of, negatives that might come out of this. So let me move from that to talking about sort of, a framework for thinking about these specific kinds of scarce societal resource allocation problems. So as I said earlier, I'm thinking about resources that are scarce. So we actually have to make decisions. Not everybody can get these. There's an argument to be made that actually we'd be a lot better off if we just spent a lot more money on some of these problems, and that make the scarcity go away, rather than what people will sometimes call tinkering at the edges, like we try to do. But we're trying to do the best that we can to make change happen over here. And secondly, these are controlled or regulated by society. So think about things like social safety net resources, which I'll be talking mostly about homelessness resources today, because that's what we do a lot of our work on. But you can also think about, K through 12 education, which I've given as an example, which again are public resources. You can think about other areas where it's not necessarily public resources, but we don't want to allow the free market to operate. So organ transplantation is another example of that. So you could think about, how do priority lists for organ transplantation get set up? So it turns out that a lot of this has been studied under the moniker of what's called local justice in the political philosophy literature, which looks deeply at this question of how are institutions actually set up to make these decisions, right? And what are the different types of institutions that we've constructed to do this over time? So my argument here is that analyzing AI systems for the allocation of scarce societal resources through this local justice lens can help clarify our objectives and identify where in the pipeline AI and algorithmic techniques can help. So I want to try to give some examples of our work in trying to do that. So for most of the rest of the talk, I'll be talking about some of the work that we've been doing in our group over the last almost decade. And I'll talk about sort of who actually did a lot of the work, including my students and collaborators at the end. But I want to note before I start that all of this is really a very my partner in crime in all of this is Patrick Fowler, who is a professor at WashU in St. Louis in the Brown School, which is social work and public health. And he's an expert on homelessness and prevention and all of this stuff. And so that's where really the domain expertise of this that I've kind of hopefully imbibed some off by osmosis over the last 10 years comes from. But he's very deeply engaged with the community side of this. And we work with a bunch of students and postdocs in all of this work. So let me give you a little bit of it's a little bit of a cartoon, but we need models to work through things, and this is the model that we work within, right? So we assume in the world of service provision for those experiencing homelessness that what's going to happen is that a household is going to get in touch with some kind of a centralized hotline when they are experiencing homelessness or when they believe that they're at risk of experiencing homelessness. When they call this hotline, right, we consider that a contact for services. And then we're going to consider 4 different types of services that these households typically get allocated to. And these you can think of as kind of almost ordered by intensity. So transitional housing is actually the most intensive services. It'll typically provide housing as well as other resources like, mental health support, addiction support, all of these other kinds of things. Rapid rehousing is another service that's considered intensive because it's expensive, but it's basically just providing the housing side of that equation for a certain amount of time without necessarily all the other supports. Emergency shelters are what you usually think of when you think about homeless shelters, right? They're the first line response if you have beds available. They're typically fairly time restricted and they don't provide a lot of other support in addition. And then homelessness prevention is kind of even a lighter touch one. It's that many people who are actually, who you would consider homeless may have a place that they can shelter. But for example, it may be the middle of winter in Minneapolis and they didn't have the money to pay their heating bills, and so they can't actually stay in the place that they're available to shelter. So that's even kind of a lower touch version of the intervention. And just to give you a sense of what we're looking at, so we have HMIS data for St. Louis. Over a course of 7 years is most of what I'll be basing this talk on. We also have a bunch of other things that we're working on now. But we have about 14,000 data points in this data set. And if you look at the sort of metric that we're going to think about, it's whether after you receive services, do you kind of successfully exit from homelessness. And the way we measure that, and this is again a measurement issue, but the measure that HUD likes to use, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, is did you re-enter or did you need services again within 2 years after exiting? And you can see that these interventions are vastly different in terms of what proportion of people needed services again after re-entry, ranging from 43% of those who got emergency shelter down to 14% of those who got prevention. But that's not actually telling us anything about the efficacy of the services, right, because of this selection problem. The people who are getting homelessness prevention are typically in much better shape going in than the people who are being sent to emergency shelters. So we need to think a little bit carefully about that. All right, so how do we actually decide who should be allocated these resources? And this is where this general framework of local justice that I'm going to try to mathematize a little bit over here comes in. So let's say you could reduce individual welfare to a single dimension W. Which of course sounds ridiculous, but in practice it's what we try to do in many of these kinds of situations. Now, consider sort of, 3 different households over here, and these arrows are telling me if I were to give them a certain intervention, sort of the bottom of the arrow is where do they start, and the top of the arrow is where would they end up if given this intervention, all right? So you could try to prioritize based on various different ideas of who should get this resource, and we actually use all of them in different settings in the world, and that's kind of the point of the local justice idea. So you could try to prioritize based on what I'll call minimum pre-allocation W, right? That's essentially equivalent to saying I want to prioritize the household or the person who is most vulnerable coming in, right? So before they get the intervention, who's in kind of the worst state? And this is actually something that is often used in homelessness services. People try to implement this by thinking about sort of various notions of vulnerability. And they say the people who are at the highest level of vulnerability are those who you should prioritize for the most intensive services. There are many other examples of this notion of prioritization. So for example, a liver transplantation in the US is typically done based on MELD scores, which are these scores that, again, kind of are measuring how sick you are. And the sicker you get, the higher the MELD score you get, the higher you rise on the liver transplant list. You could instead choose to allocate based on the maximum post-allocation W. So this would say who's going to be best leaving the system, right? So this seems like actually somewhat unusual, but this is a critique that is often made of elite college admissions in the US, for example. They don't really care what they're going to add. They want to pick the people who are going to do really well once they've graduated from college, right? So if you think about the critiques of sort of Ivy League universities, it's like, oh, they're just picking the students who are going to come and like donate huge amounts to them when they're done, or who they already know are going to be Nobel Prize winners. They're not educating the folks who could really like benefit from it the most. And that's the third criterion, right? Which is this idea of prioritize by maximum benefit. So who's getting the most marginal benefit from receiving this resource? Who sees the greatest increase? This actually came up during COVID a bunch when you may have seen a bunch. There were newspaper articles on how do hospitals decide who gets ventilators in these kinds of situations. And in those, what you see is that they want to try to prioritize those who would see the maximum increase in their probability of survival given that they got the ventilator. So you won't give the ventilator to the people who are going to be OK without it, and you're not going to give it to the people who you think are probably going to die even if you put them on a ventilator. So it's a terrible situation to be in, and it leads to these fears of what we call abandonment in this literature, but it is something that does, in some situations like battlefield triage, that's exactly what the principles that we've decided on. One point that I want to make over here, and I think that this brings up sort of an interesting parallel between what we're thinking about in AI ethics and the bioethics literature, is that one of the founding sort of events of bioethics as a discipline was what's called the Seattle God Committee. I don't know how many people have heard of that, but it was a committee that was formed in Seattle in the early days of dialysis to decide who should get access to these like life-saving machines at that point in time, right? And then again, it was scarce, not everybody could get it. And so they had this committee of 4 or 5 people who would sit and they'd have these conversations, and these got transcribed, and you can go and look it up. They'd be having these discussions among themselves about who should we save. Should it be, the businessman who is married and has 3 children, or should it be the person who goes to church regularly, or should it be the single mother? And they had to make all of these decisions. And they're thinking about individual aspects of the person. And one of the sort of things that was ethically kind of decided in response to all of this was that that's really not what we should be doing. What we should be doing is just thinking about people individually, not doing these comparisons of, how does this person compare to that person? Just how would this treatment affect this person within themselves, and be able to make comparisons within that, which is also why this, reducing individual welfare to a single dimension is a useful abstraction to think about this through. All right. So I just want to say, OK, so we're going to be talking about AI a bunch over here, right? But what would happen in this kind of a situation without AI? Because there's a lot of people who will, there's a reflex, I think it's probably not necessarily that prevalent in this room since everybody's thinking about good systems over here, but there's a reflex where many people say we shouldn't be using AI for this stuff at all, right? We don't want AI here. And there's actually there's a great fact paper from a few years ago by Rebecca Johnson and her colleague that looked at this question of what's called a bureaucratic counterfactual that says, you know, what actually happens in many of these situations, it's not like you have some great human decision maker. Instead, we typically have point systems. And people look at feature vectors the same way that a machine learning algorithm would do, but they just like sum up a certain number of points based on different features that you have. And in this case, you know, so I'm just giving an example over here, which could be that if you're trying to quantify vulnerability, this is actually a way in which we end up doing it ourselves that is based on this measure called VI-SPDAT. But you can basically give people points for saying, for example, if they're older than 60 or younger than 18, then you add a point to their vulnerability score. If they receive HIV/AIDS services, you add another point to their score, and so on and so forth. And then you total up their score, and you say those who have the most points are highest on the vulnerability list. So that's an example over here. So the point that I'm trying to make over there is just that, like, you know, when we're talking about AI, we're not comparing it to a vacuum or to like some optimal decision-making process. We're typically comparing it to a process that looks a lot more like this. So, which again has some benefits, right? It's pretty transparent. It could be useful, but let's just keep that in mind. So I'm going to be talking about, you know, this specific situation, and what we have is we have a whole bunch of data that actually looks, you know, we have all of those types of features that you just saw, which is actually like pretty rich and very sensitive data about a bunch of individuals. And we are also able to track whether or not they called back for services within the next 2 years. And so what we try to do is we try to figure out, OK, what is the probability of reentry for different households? So that's going to be sort of what we are trying to measure over here. So you can just think about this as like, you know, we have maybe 3 different households over here, and we can estimate let's say we can estimate their probabilities of reentry, conditional on receiving transitional housing or receiving emergency shelters, and so on. One point that is worth making, which I stressed earlier as well, is just that, you know, we may not be great at this. And the reason is because it may be that, for example, a single mother with one child has almost never been assigned to rapid rehousing in the past because they get priority for going to transitional housing. So we actually don't know how well that type of household would perform in that type of intervention, right? So, of course, you know, there's hopefully enough variation in the data, but this is a classic problem with administrative data sets. There's hopefully enough variation in the data that we would be able to figure out, you know, something about this from the data. So in this case, you know, I'm going to kind of elide that problem. What we do is we use a method called BART that has been used in the statistics literature that has, you know, some decent evidence that it's able to do a reasonable job of predicting these types of counterfactual probabilities, even with these observational data sets. And we're going to take those predictions as kind of reasonable predictions of these probabilities of reentry. We did a bunch of different kinds of analysis to try to make sure that this wasn't completely out there as a way of doing that. Now, one question that we could ask is, like, you know, how effective is the current system, and could we get benefits from just rejiggering that system? And this was, you know, one of the first papers that we published about this whole domain in the first place. But the interesting thing about that, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, was we thought about this problem that says, OK, are we basically just not doing as good of a matching as we could be doing? Are there efficiency gains to be had from just, for example, switching around who gets sent to which intervention? And so we did a counterfactual analysis of, like, you know, on a weekly basis, if we could reassign households to different interventions, how well would they have done? And we found that, like, you know, there may be some improvement. We could reduce reentry rates perhaps by about 5% if you believe the assumptions of our analysis. But, you know, and by doing so, we would improve outcomes for 35% of households. But this is also not without some distributional consequences. There are 21% of households that would not do as well under the intervention that we are telling them to give under the new prediction plus matching framework compared to what they originally received. And so, you know, potential benefits to be gained, but we have to think a little bit more carefully about who's being helped, who's being hurt. And so in order to sort of dive into that, we tried to look at, can we better understand which groups are being helped or being hurt by different allocation methods? And we found something that at the time surprised us. It's in keeping with a lot of the literature that's been evolving in this space. But we looked at this question to say, OK, can we look at demographic or intersectional groups in this data and understand whether the allocations that are being made are fair? And this connects two major research threads in the literature. There's a whole literature on fairness in machine learning that has emerged over the last 10, 12 years with a whole bunch of interesting results in there, including a whole lot of impossibility theorems about how you can't satisfy two different reasonable seeming fairness notions simultaneously. But there's also a rich history of what's called fair division in the economics and computational social choice literatures that actually looks at the big difference I would characterize as saying that actually looks at preferences and how you think about the outcomes of different allocation mechanisms given individual preferences. Of course, in this case, we don't have individual preferences, but what we do have is we have these predicted outcomes, right? So we have some notion of what utility would look like under different decisions, and therefore it's reasonable to think of that as individual preferences and to try to see, is one group doing better than another under these different possible allocations. So let's start by thinking about two different notions of, outcomes for different groups. And I'm going to call one of these improvement and one of these regret. Improvement simply asks, how much better do you do than you would have done in the worst allocation I could give you? Regret, which is a term that is borrowed from the computer science literature on this area, is basically saying, hey, if I give you the best thing that you could possibly get, right, how much worse are you doing compared with that? So if we take these two ideas, we found that as long as any two groups, and these could be demographic groups, intersectional groups, or anything, if there's a difference in how they respond to different interventions, which would be the whole point. If there's no differences in how they respond to different interventions, then we are at this very simple thing where there's not very much we can do. But as long as there are any differences in those, and in particular in the variance of their responses, we cannot simultaneously achieve fairness on both the improvement criterion and the regret criterion. And in fact, worse than that, we can show that there exists a policy that appears to favor one group with respect to improvement fairness and the other group with respect to regret fairness. So based on how you're analyzing these policies, the same allocation you could say is unfair and biased towards group A if you're thinking about it in terms of improvement, but group B if you're thinking about it in terms of regret. So that is a weird kind of situation to end up in, although it's kind of consistent with this history of impossibility theorems in this space. And so this is an existence result. This is math, right? Could it be a real problem? So what we did was we went and we analyzed our data along certain intersectional groups that are of particular interest to the homelessness community. And we looked, so this picture, we can just look at the one on the left. The one on the right is very similar, except it's looking at multiplicative rather than additive measures of fairness. The one on the left, the way to interpret this graph is that if the bar is pointing towards the left, we're favoring the group that is written on the left in the legend over there. And if the bar is pointing towards the right, it appears to be favoring the group that's on the right. So if you look at the very top line over there, what this is saying is that if you were to consider improvement, we appear to be favoring the group without children. Whereas if we look at regret, we're favoring the group with children. Depending on how you're analyzing this, you might say your policy is biased towards those with children or those without children. We see the same thing with, for example, black males versus white males, right? Based on improvement, it appears to be favoring black males, but based on regret, it appears to be favoring white males. And what our mathematical result shows is that there's basically no way around this, right? So again, it's a question of defining what you care about a little more carefully. So that's sort of the main takeaway from this particular example. I'm just going to leave that to roll around. I cannot be fair to both mics simultaneously. So, all right. So All right, so we've got some somewhat negative results over there, but equally importantly, I think it's just a question of saying, hey, think about what it is that you care about, right? Before you decide on what methods to go to try to achieve the things that you care about over here. Our next question that we asked on this line of research was basically to say, okay, how do AI predictions, these kinds of predictions that we're making about, like, if I were to give this household emergency shelter versus transitional housing, how would it affect their outcomes? Suppose I were to give caseworkers this information, how would it affect their decision making? Now, just to be clear, this first experiment was not done with caseworkers. We did this with lay people who were recruited on Mechanical Turk. But we wanted to get an understanding of it and kind of pilot this design. And our hope is to actually, within the next couple of years, be able to replicate some of this work with caseworkers. But we wanted to just try to understand, what kinds of decisions would people make in these kinds of situations. So we're going to ask very much this question we've been thinking about: who should be prioritized for a scarce resource? And the question that we're interested in here is just like, would you prioritize the more vulnerable one or the one who would have a better outcome? Remember earlier I showed you 3 different possibilities: vulnerability, outcome, or marginal benefit. It turns out that in the particular case we set up, it's very hard to distinguish between better outcome and marginal benefit, so I'm just going to call that better outcome for the purposes of what I'm talking about here. So how does providing predictions on top of that interact with decision maker priorities and potentially institutional goals? So this was a Mechanical Turk survey with 520 participants. We did a whole bunch of the usual stuff that you would do to try to ensure that people were paying attention and so on and so forth. Lots of details in the paper if you're interested, but I just want to give a little vignette here to show you what kinds of tasks typically people doing this would face. So, essentially you can think about it, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but you can think about it as saying, okay, some people would see, hey, I have 2 different households over here, household 1, household 2. If you look at this example, right, household 1 we see is a 35-year-old female who has a monthly income of $668, no disabling condition, no substance abuse services, but has called a hotline 15 times. And they're coming from permanent housing for formerly homeless persons, but they're not able to maintain a place there. Whereas the other person has received substance abuse services, gets $800 a month, and comes from a place not meant for habitation. So who would you prioritize in these kinds of situations? And what we want to try to compare this to is whether you're going to change what you do if you are given these machine learning style predictions of how well they would do under the different resources that you might be able to offer them. So this is saying household 1 has a high probability of needing future services within 2 years given transitional housing or emergency shelter, whereas household 2 has a low predicted probability if given transitional housing, but a medium probability if given emergency shelter. So in this case, would this change the kinds of decisions that people make? And we have various of these vignettes that we constructed. I just want to give you sort of the main highlight result over here. There's kind of 2 that I want to talk about. One is that people, when they're doing this task, are pretty consistent in the kinds of prioritization decisions that they make. So people tend to either be pretty consistently vulnerability-oriented, which would, so these 2 graphs are just showing 2 different scores that are slightly different from each other, but basically the same. We can just focus on the left one, the vulnerability-oriented score. Higher means you're more vulnerability-oriented. You will typically go for the more vulnerable household. And you can see that there's this clear distinction. Very few people are falling in the middle. Almost everyone is falling on the right tail or the left tail. The left tail would indicate that you're outcome-oriented. The right tail there would indicate that you're vulnerability-oriented. So that's sort of point number 1. Point number 2 is, how are these folks affected by getting this AI advice provision? So if you look at these groups, people who are vulnerability-oriented versus outcome-oriented, without any AI advice, they actually look very similar to each other, right? They're actually, they get outcome-oriented scores that are indistinguishable from each other statistically speaking. However, once you provide the advice in addition to this, the outcome-oriented sees their outcome-oriented score shoot up, and the vulnerability-oriented group sees their vulnerability-oriented score shoot down. So providing the AI advice, and we controlled fairly carefully for the sequence of experiments that kind of showed this, is basically allowing people in some way to like reveal their types. Maybe just by looking at that information that they see earlier, they aren't able to really assess what outcomes would look like or how vulnerable somebody is. But once you provide that advice, they're much better able to do that, and they can take decisions that are aligned with sort of the type that they are expressing over here. So that's an interesting point. And I mean, there's actually like various nuances over here, because you could even think about the fact that what might be happening is that when you provide, and we do see some evidence of this, like when you frame the question more quantitatively, people become more outcome-oriented. And if you don't frame the question as quantitatively, people tend to be less outcome-oriented in making the decision. So there's all kinds of potentially subtle interactions between what people are thinking about when they're making these decisions and what kind of decisions they are likely to make. Of course, big caveat, as I said, this is all lay people, right? They don't have rich or tremendous experience in this domain. It's entirely possible that caseworkers actually understand this domain very well and would not necessarily show exactly the same kinds of behaviors. So that's hopefully a study that's coming up. The last thing I want to talk about briefly is actually kind of a parallel study, because what we wanted to do was we actually wanted to look at the data and try to see if the data could tell us something about what caseworkers actually end up doing in practice, right? Because we actually see what kinds of decisions they end up making. Of course, that the setting of actual decision making is not this very kind of stylized setting that we did in the experiment, where you get to choose one household that goes to a certain thing. All we see in the data is which intervention were you actually assigned. And so the question that we asked over here is like, maybe by looking at people who didn't get the intervention that we think that they should have been assigned, we can uncover these instances where these caseworkers, who we call street-level bureaucrats, which is a literature that has been around in sociology for the last 40 plus years, that's really thinking about frontline service providers who interact with people, what kinds of decisions do they make? So when do they not go by the rules? Is there something about the households where they're not going by the rules where we can learn something interesting? And so what we did was we did two things. We tried to learn a very simple interpretable set of rules for the decisions that they're making about which interventions to assign households to. So we learned essentially short decision trees. And we found that they do a relatively good job of predicting which intervention a household is going to be assigned to, which is in keeping with this theory of street-level bureaucracy that says most cases are decided by forming some simple heuristics and using those simple heuristics to make those decisions. And the cases that are not decided by those simple heuristics are the ones where some discretion is being applied. So that is point number one. Point number two, though, which is interesting, is that if you learn a more complex model of decision making, so in this case, we're doing gradient boosting, it turns out that we can actually achieve very high accuracy, significantly higher in predicting which interventions households are going to be assigned by the actual caseworkers in the data. So that means that they're pretty consistent, even when that consistency is not captured by very simple rules. So that's also an interesting fact to think about over here. So now what we turned to was exactly this question of like, are there cases where they're applying their discretion that is not captured by these simple rules? And we looked at two cases. One where we predict that they should be given transitional housing, but they're actually getting emergency shelter. So that would be households who are getting a less intensive intervention than you would have expected. And the other side of it is people who you predicted would be getting emergency shelter, but are actually getting transitional housing. So they're getting a more intensive intervention than you would have expected. And what we find is, OK, so we're able to find a sufficient number of these, and then we try to understand what is driving these decisions, and are they good for the households who are the subjects of discretion. So I'm just going to show you two quick slides, and then I'm going to conclude. One is that we actually quantify these households based on this vulnerability score that I was showing you earlier. just to get a sense of what would they score like on something that's very similar to one of the actual metrics that gets used for scoring them. And we also use our predictions of how well they will do in these different interventions to try to understand what was the benefit of changing that decision, right? How much better does this household do than they would have done otherwise, or how much worse do they do than they would have done otherwise? Because presumably they would have done better in transitional housing typically. And here's what's interesting, right? So this is just a non-parametric bootstrap statistical test to see whether these are significant. So if you're out of that histogram, that means that it's significant. But what this is basically showing you is in both of these cases, the households on whom discretion is being applied, by which I mean households that are predicted to get one thing but end up getting a different one, are systematically lower in their vulnerability scores than the households on whom discretion is not applied. And this is true on both sides of it. So that means that caseworkers are basically systematically making sure not to apply discretion to those who are scoring high on the vulnerability scale. They're sticking with the rules on those cases, right? Now we can also ask, how much better do they do? Or how much worse do they do? And what you would expect is that the households who get transitional housing should do significantly better than you would necessarily have expected, and the households who get emergency shelter should do worse. But how much better or worse do they do than a random group that you could have picked up to do this? So that now we're asking, are we doing something sensible and useful? Are they able to use their discretion to achieve better outcomes? And the answer turns out to be yes. And the way that this shows that is if you look at the graph on the left, what it's showing us is that the marginal gain in utility for those who are put into transitional housing is significantly higher than you would expect from a statistical test. Whereas the marginal decline in utility of those who get emergency shelter when they were predicted to get transitional housing actually falls well within the distribution of what a random group over there would get. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that those human beings who, keep in mind, they don't have access to any of these predictions, right? These are machine learning predictions made 10 years later of like how these households would have done. They're able to pick up on something that is systematically showing them that like this is a good set of households to pick for this particular intervention. So there's something really interesting going on in the kinds of decision making that these street-level bureaucrats are doing, which is exactly what you would hope for and expect in these kinds of situations, but also points to, some interesting questions about what would happen if you supplemented this with AI or you allowed them to use AI or, not something I advocate for, but which is being talked about a lot, like these days in many contexts, is replacing them with AI, right? So these are things to really think about. All right, so this was the last sort of substantive thing I wanted to talk about. I'm just going to close with sort of two things. One is, so we're designing these systems, but one thing that we often don't think about in the design of these systems, and honestly, actually, this goes back to the 90s. It was when Elster published his book on local justice. One of Al Roth, who won the Nobel Prize in economics and is well-known for incredible work on matching theory, one of his critiques was that this doesn't consider incentives, right? When you set up a local justice-based institution, it might change people's incentives, and you may no longer be able to understand exactly what types they are, and that could end up leading to bad outcomes in the system. And so agents may not be truthful if they're in one of these systems. And so we've done a bunch of work thinking through this as well, and this is sort of somewhat more theoretical and data-oriented work in different domains. But for example, one result we have, which I think is actually really interesting, is there's been this whole push to do fair machine learning, and there's a bunch of algorithms that attempt to take a standard machine learning algorithm and make it more fair with respect to group fairness kinds of metrics. And one thing that we find in those situations is that this can actually cause what we call a fairness reversal, where when agents respond strategically, knowing these algorithms are going to be in play, you end up in a situation where the outcome is less fair than it would have been if you'd just been using the original algorithm. And so thinking about strategic responses in these cases is, I think, very important. We've worked a bunch on whether you can use a restricted budget of audits to try to promote truthful behavior in these kinds of settings, and that's sort of an active area of research as well, but it's something to think about. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but like I just want to say one of the things that we're working pretty actively on is actually trying to think about how one uses risk scores. For example, the Nevada risk scores that I started everything off with. But in this case, we're looking at risk scores for eviction and trying to understand, can those kinds of risk scores be helpful when they're input to an algorithm that is doing something interesting? In this case, figuring out how to route caseworkers in cities to go and canvass these households and provide them with information on possible resources that are available to them. And we show that actually, these risk scores can be pretty useful in those kinds of settings. So it's an interesting intersection with thinking about sort of urban problems, which I know like I've heard a lot about over the past couple of days. And so there's some interesting work in that space going on in general. Finally, sort of in the big picture, right, I think I've hammered this point home enough, but just to do it one more time, I think humans will have and will continue to have a huge role to play in figuring out how should we design and shape these AI systems, in particular, what objectives should they be trying to achieve. I think computing has important roles in this. This is a quote from a paper by Rediat Abebe and co-authors that says, as a formalizer, computing shapes how social problems are explicitly defined, changing how those problems and possible responses to them are understood. And I think that's one major sort of good thing that AI for good or good systems or all of these kinds of projects are able to achieve. I think it's important to find where in the pipeline AI can best aid decision making. And my own sort of evolving research goal as things go is not necessarily to build systems that can be deployed as such, but really to think about how can this inform policy, and maybe down the line, how can some of these things be integrated into systems of decision making in close partnership with stakeholders. Just I want to say, as with any sort of computer science professor, I think most of this work was done by amazing students. Tasfia Mashiat, who just graduated from George Mason, Gaurav Pokharel, a student of mine at Virginia Tech, Alex DiCristofano, who is going to defend soon at WashU, and students who have graduated in the past, Amanda Kubi, Andrew Esternel, Xavier Gitio. And as I said, all of this is a very close collaboration with Patrick Fowler at WashU, but also some of this work is co-authored with Eugene Vorobeichik at WashU, Josefa Rangwala at Mason, and Yang Liu at UC Santa Cruz. And thanks to the NSF, which has always been a tremendous supporter of work, and I hope will continue to be so in the future, and also to Amazon for support on this. And thank you all for your time and for listening. Actually, I guess I probably don't need. Can I stick with this? Yeah. Okay. So I will.
Can you hear? Yeah. Great. So yeah, thank you very much, Sameh, for a great talk. It resonates very well, as you said, with what we think about here in good systems. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to have this. I guess it's called fireside chat, but there's no fire here. It's plant-side chat for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. So please, think about your questions. We'll have about 10 minutes for that as well. As usual, come up to the microphones. So there's so much we could dig into on your talk. I'd like to start that I completely agree with this point. I think it's a fantastic point that we need to be comparing AI systems with the status quo, and I've made this point for years in a different context, in the context of autonomous cars, autonomous driving, where it seems like what society is demanding from autonomous car companies is perfection, zero fatalities, or else we're not interested. Whereas human drivers are leading to 40,000 fatalities a year, and it seems obvious, at least from a utilitarian perspective, that if we could get maybe 5,000 fatalities with autonomous cars, that would be a win. And yet, that's not where things are going. So you gave an example of how we can compare against the status quo from a technical perspective or from a comparison perspective. How can we get people to agree that AI should be compared against the status quo, as opposed to setting a much higher standard for AI systems?
You couldn't start with an easy question, could you? No, so this is a great question, right? Because it's, and I mean, I think that the autonomous vehicles example is superb on that front. I'm not sure that I have an answer. I'll point out a few things that I think help, right? And from what I've learned. One, at least in this domain, I don't know so much about the autonomous vehicles domain. I've just been following that, as an interested bystander. But over here, I think the things that people really care about are, one, they're worried about scale, right? The fact that you put an AI system in, it can suddenly, for example, deny benefits to tens of thousands of people. And there's nobody there you can appeal to in the way that people are used to being able to do it, right? So that's sort of one fear that I think is very well founded and that we need to grapple with, is this idea of like, if this suddenly happens at scale, what am I going to lose? What am I scared of? And then, what is the kind of situation that this will leave me in? And I think that's tied to this question of recourse, right? Of if something, and that one I think maybe also speaks more closely to autonomous driving, is this question of like, if something bad were to happen, right, who can I go to? What can I do on that front? And I want to be able to, in this case, go to somebody and have them tell me, why did this happen, and on what basis can I appeal it? And I think a success story on that front has been credit scores over the years, right? This was also essentially like a somewhat opaque machine learning algorithm producing these credit scores for a while. And I think over the years, regulation and sort of, the self-interest of the industry led them to make it somewhat easier for people to understand what's going into your credit score, how can you improve your credit score, how can you monitor your credit score. So I think there are ideas from this that might help in terms of like, getting people to think about sort of, what's happening. I do think that the counterfactual argument is a very strong one from the technical side. I haven't seen it get, as much, traction with the people who might be subject to the influence of these systems.
Yeah, I really like that you emphasized the recourse or appeal aspect as opposed to the explainability, tell me why aspect, because I think that's another aspect in which people have a higher standard for AI systems. We don't know, we can't identify why our brains make decisions either. We come up with rationalizations, and we can, and people are demanding, knowing exactly why the AI system made. But recourse and appeal is something that I think is definitely something concrete that people can demand. I like that point a lot. I wonder, just to push a little further, there's also there's the counterfactual societally, right? Like, we moved from 40,000 fatalities to 5,000 fatalities. That seems good. But then there's also the counterfactual individually. If it was my relative that's one of those 5,000 and they wouldn't have been one of the 40,000, then there is this, there's a legitimate complaint. How also can we, address people who are saying, when we're saying, look, we can demonstrate that we're making these decisions more fairly for society, and yet you would have been better under the status quo. How do you answer that person?
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, and this is exactly, and I mean, this is actually, again, not necessarily good answers, but like this was one of the things that we really thought about a bunch with the first paper that I was talking about, the first paper that really got us on this front, which was like doing this different matching, right? Where we're trying to like take predictions and then we're trying to move people around between the interventions that they get to see like, can we achieve better outcomes overall in terms of rates of return to homelessness. And I think in that case, this was a question that we used to get a lot, right? What do you do? Like some people are doing worse. Right, and you're not going to get something that's Pareto improving, unfortunately, in any of these kinds of situations. And so I think that, like, at some level, again, my bias is to say we need to, in some way, ensure this compact with the public in advance of it happening, and that's essentially a social and political thing that we have to do. We have to say, this system is better. Let's win hearts and minds on saying, we are going to do this because it's going to be better for people as a whole. And, that's how it's going to be, and have that sort of, in place before the things start happening. Because at some level, there's just so much variance in the world, right, in terms of outcomes and like, who gets hurt by something, or even if you have a machine learning system, right now we know with predictive multiplicity and all of these kinds of things that the same person could end up getting a different outcome from one training set versus a different training set, even though they're the same. And I think that in some way educating people and getting their buy-in to this idea that like, hey, the system is going to be better overall, and we expect it'll be better for everyone because of that, as like sort of an argument and expectation, might be a way to go. But it's a very, very hard problem. And I think that hopefully, there's people who understand people better than I do who will be able to take that on and think about how to do it.
So the easy answer, just win people's hearts and minds. That's the
exactly,
solution, right? Okay, well, I want to go down a little further down that path, perhaps, but let me ask what I anticipate might be an easier question, but I think I think people would be really interested in the answer as well. So you're doing some fascinating work coming from the computer science side, but identifying applications that have real societal impact. And there's a small number of people. You're one of them in the community who have that knack, who have been able to do that. I think also Milan Tambe, who you know very well as well, and who's been here as a good system speaker before as well. I just saw a talk from him. He's helping mothers in India respond to health phone calls and things like that. How do you find an application that suits your the technical computer science tools you have that will benefit society if you could get it deployed, and that people will actually deploy? How do you get those three things? How do you choose your applications?
So I have to say on the third one, I'm not sure, right? This is all stuff that we're constantly in the, in the realm of like trying to talk to people, trying to get some buy-in on these things being useful. But on the first two, I guess, so for me, and again, this may not be generally the most useful, like a lot of it ends up being a question of, can you find people you love working with? And like, who will drive you on to like, doing the kinds of things that you care about. And so like in some of these cases, it takes many iterations. Like I've had many things, so obviously like, I've cared about like doing stuff that is good for society for a long time. And I had various different projects going at various points in time that were trying to do in completely different domains, right? I mean, 12 years ago, I was really interested in vaccine misinformation and trying to understand how vaccine misinformation was spreading on internet message boards, right? And just, what happened ended up being that like, a couple of grants we wrote did not get funded. I, didn't have the strongest relationship with anybody I was working on with that project and so on. But they ended up introducing me to the person I've been working on homelessness with now for the last 10 years. And like suddenly, that struck a chord and we had some conversations and we were able to talk to each other and, to our broader set of colleagues in ways that were exciting, interesting, and just sort of kept us going. And I think that for me, it's really a question of like, am I having like really interesting conversations with people who like, care about the domain? And, are we able to like push stuff forward together? Because I think it's very easy to fall into sort of, different traps. And one of these is the trap of sort of modeling in a vacuum, right? Building a perfectly nice theoretical model and like, proving really nice results on it in a way that is very distant from the original motivation for the model. Versus if you go out there and you actually try to solve the problem for an agency, or if you talk to school systems, which I'm doing a lot of these days, they want a product, right? And that's also not something that is like, I have no objection to, turning out products, but that's not what drives me in doing these things. And so I think you have to find the right person to work with. And for me, that's always been finding somebody who is an academic on the other side, right? So a social scientist or somebody in the humanities or something like that who really has deep domain knowledge, but who I can talk to and who understands, what it's like to be driven by the ideas. And so that's been really fun, and that's kind of what drives me on that front. But I'll also say, partly it's luck, right? It's like you end up finding these people or not finding these people. And I think one of the great things that I was thinking over here is that by doing something like Good Systems, you guys are greatly increasing the probability of finding these matches, right? Because there's incentive for people to get together across disciplinary boundaries and talk to each other. And the first person you talk to may not be the person you hit it off with, like, but you will hopefully find somebody in the longer run.
And I guess, as you're saying, for the real big real world impact, you do need to also partner with somebody who will take it and turn it into a product.
Yep.
Because that's what needs to happen for it to really have the influence that you want it to. So.
Yes, I agree, and that's something that I need to get better at too.
Okay, I'll ask one more question. I'll invite people who want to ask to jump in right after this question to come up to the mics. And that's it. And this is sort of going back closer to the first discussion point, but you gave these really good examples of different ways of defining fairness, right? The minimum pre-allocation, which people do with liver transplants, and maximum post-allocation, which people do with colleges, elite college admissions, and greatest increase that people did with COVID ventilators, and then the benefit to society that was done for dialysis. So these really, and every one of them, you think about them and you say, oh yeah, it makes sense that they're doing it that way. But who decides, or how do you decide which of these is the right one, and how did it become that each of those was matched to those, and what would have happened otherwise? Like where did it's an observation that this has happened, but who decides and how?
So that's a really interesting question, and that's actually that is, I think, in some ways the fundamental question of this book, Local Justice, right? Which and a lot of the literature around that as well is really how do institutions come up with these kinds of rules, and and it, at least if you pay attention to what that book says, right, it's very much kind of a social process of what drives us towards making those decisions, but also human societies have been grappling with these questions for actually thousands of years in some form. The modern administrative state makes it very salient, but groups have had to make these kinds of decisions and think about where this is going to come from for a while, and so and it's also constantly evolving, right? So there's this. So Social Security is an example, right, where one of the reasons why Social Security came about was exactly this abandonment problem that shows itself up in local justice again and again, which is just that we don't want people who are old to be out on the street with no system support, because we are thinking, hey, what if that's going to be me at some point in time, right? And various other things eventually lead to a social compact that says, hey, we're willing to do this. And so for each of these situations, right, I think that in the specific examples that we were talking about, the ones where this minimum welfare or highest vulnerability comes in are really both sort of a combination of safety net and abandonment principles. They're basically saying, I don't want to be in that situation where I know I will not be able to get a liver if I need a liver because I'm too sick or I'm too old or something like that. I want there to always be some chance that I will make it, that I will survive. And then in other situations, everybody doesn't need admission to an elite college, right? Most people do wonderfully without going to elite colleges, and the same thing kind of applies over there. Therefore, you can get away with that kind of thing in some of those situations. And so I think the main point is actually that it's very context dependent, and it's very dependent on the specific thing that is being allocated, and it's hard to come up with general principles over there. And that's one of the main points Elster is actually trying to make, is that we really need to go in and study these systems to understand why they evolved to be the way they are.
Okay, well, by some principle of social justice that I don't have a label for, I'm going to start with the microphone with the longest line. So, Sherry, go first.
Thank you very much. This is an incredibly important framework, and I really appreciate your research in WashU and local justice. And I have been thinking about these issues, too, for quite a while, whether it was with transplants or mortgages or driving, and particularly housing and homelessness, which I've worked on, including with Good Systems for several years in the city of Austin and stakeholders. And the data is very difficult, and the data is so disparate and so messy. And so I find that to be a big issue that I wanted to ask you about. And then secondly, looking at your research, it looks like you are doing comparisons with people who have been somewhere in this system of service provision for the unhoused. Have you looked at or considered looking at, because this is something that I'm considering, trying to predict those who have never been part of the system for those unhoused, and what would be a tipping point?
Yeah, okay. Fantastic questions. On the first one, the data, yes. So there are more than 400 different communities in the US that all have to set up their own rules under HUD guidelines for how they're going to do the prioritization.
With the HMIS.
And they're all, exactly, and they're all required to put this data into HMIS, but at the same time, they can come up with their own allocation rules as long as they fit according to these principles.
And also, it's not just that. There's all these other entities that have data on unhoused.
Yeah, exactly. And so I will just say, right, all of that data is for us from St. Louis, and we started working on. So for us, we started working on this data. The one thing that we have in addition that is really great is we have this hotline data, which enables us to figure out people calling for services, not just people who actually enter the system. And so we have thought about this question of can we do something with that? But the data on those people is just not as good. But I will just say that we spent, I think we started working with this data in 2015, and we had 2 students working on it for 2 to 3 years before we even got it into a form that could get us, 1 workshop paper out of it, which is typically, it was a lot of work trying to understand and massage, because it was coming from all these disparate providers, because you're getting data from an individual shelter, or you're getting it from all of these places, and you don't understand what it means half the time. And so it was a huge effort, and it's very, very difficult on that front. On the unhoused, on the at-risk front, right, there's a bunch of things. So one thing that we are doing right now is that this eviction stuff that I was talking about is actually a partnership with a civic tech company called Ptolemy, and various local community partners as well, where we're basically trying to figure out, and I mean, it's 1 point higher in the scale. And we're actually not using any individual data on the household that's at risk over there. We're actually trying to work through data on the property owner and the property to identify properties that may be at risk, to try to ameliorate sort of some things that might come up over there. And to really think about, can we connect them? Because most of the problem with eviction is just people, a big problem with it is that people don't have legal representation, and they don't know that they can get legal representation. And so that's sort of one of the big issues that we're trying to think about. This tipping point question is a great one. I don't think we have data that can help us answer it. We've thought about it. But yeah, and I mean, fundamentally, so Patrick is really interested in prevention, and that's a huge question. So.
Thank you. I'll follow up with you offline.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in the interest of trying to get all 3 remaining questions in and also ending fairly close to on time, let's try to make, allocate about a minute for question answer. Let's keep it short, please.
Yeah, thank you. Very stimulating, thought stimulating. Bureaucracies tend to be very procedural. And what you demonstrated very well is how can you compare the effectiveness of procedure or fairness of procedure on the individuals concerned. How can we actually leverage this further to ask the question, are these bureaucracies aware of what's my mission? What's my purpose? So what's the purpose of HUD? Homelessness happens because the procedures are not working. But are we going to struggle with better procedures, or are we going to go back to improving? How do we accomplish the purpose?
That's a great question, right? And then this also relates to big societal questions. So just one data point over there is that the greatest decrease in homelessness and improvement in outcomes happened immediately after COVID, because as a society, we pushed to make that happen. And we had all these empty hotels, and cities were let's house the homeless in hotels while this is happening. And so there's this whole question of do we have the will to do it? And what is the societal side of this? I do think that so one thing that we are interested in doing is ethnographic exploration of what are caseworkers trying to do, and what do they see as why they're making the decisions that they're making. And hopefully that'll actually provide a little bit more insight on that. Because you're right now what we have is essentially a data-oriented, and the people that we talk to tend to be a little bit higher up in the chain. So I think talking to caseworkers and trying to understand, what are they thinking as they're making these decisions is going to be a big thing on that. But thank you very much for the question. It's a really, really great one there.
Hey, great session. I'll keep it short. So in my understanding, whatever study you had done, it accounted for vulnerability, as in what is your current situation and it does not matter how did you come here, but it just matters what is your current situation. But my question is like, how do you account for good behavior? Or maybe, let's say you have been consistently doing, like building up your life, and somebody's not doing that and is vulnerable. So maybe your system may maybe benefit whatever sort of grants or something you have, you will allocate it to the most vulnerable. I understand there was like a potential thing also in your three charts, that who will be the highest, but basically my thing is like, how do we reward good behavior? And like we talk about AI, most of them like full self-driving or credit card score or admissions, they all have a prescribed behavior, as in if we use it, like the score or whatever you are saying, if we behave in a particular manner, we tend to score in a particular way, and we do that and it alters our behavior. But like, what about the rest of the good behavior that we're doing?
So yeah, I mean, I think that that's interesting. Thanks for the question. There's two separate things in there. One of these is the question of like, can you reward good behavior? In this case, what does reward mean, right? Because it's like, I'm not sure that that's directly aligned with the purpose of the system over here, right? The homelessness system as such, and I mean, again, this is a social and political choice. It doesn't have to be this way, but the reason why it exists the way it does is because we've decided that the more vulnerable are people who should be prioritized in this system. Now, that's the one thing that I didn't bring up, but that I think is very important, is actually that there is a real sort of clash in purposes, and this relates to the previous question as well, which is that we say we want to house the most vulnerable. At the same time, individual communities, at least I don't know what's going to happen under the current administration, but they've always been evaluated by HUD based on this measure of like 2-year return. These are not the same thing at all, right? These are actually already competing priorities within the system. We're saying house the most vulnerable, but at the same time, we're evaluating you based on how successful were you at getting people out of homelessness. But the other thing that I'll just add to that is just our measures, right? When we are doing the prediction of the probability that you return to homelessness, in some way, in theory, that should actually be doing what you're talking about, because it's able to take a long string of demographic information and make a prediction based on that of how well would you respond to an intervention. And so at least in theory, if you have enough data and you have the right data, it should account for good behavior, as you call it, right, in being able to predict that this household would do well in this kind of intervention. And one area where we see that, for example, is that we do think that like there's been kind of over allocation of very intensive interventions to certain populations who would actually do well in less intensive interventions like rapid rehousing as opposed to transitional housing. And single mothers is actually a good example of this, that you give them space to stay, they do a great job in general of like, using that effectively. Whereas, maybe we've been over, so maybe there's been instances of over-treatment over there, as you would call it, or something. So there's all kinds of interesting things on that front. I think it's a very interesting kind of domain. But that's one of the sort of, things that machine learning could theoretically be quite good at on this front, is like, picking up on things that we won't necessarily be able to see easily to tell us that this will be a good thing to do for someone.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
All right. Well, Sanmay, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, with your research, answering the questions. Thanks everybody here for being around for the symposium. And I think I'll now turn it over to Ken to close us out.
Thank you so much
one more time.
Me. Yeah.